Who to trust is both a personal and public question. To answer who to trust today is complicated by our limited capacity and limited experience to interpret so many signals and sources. It's particularly complex for children, relying on others, parents and teachers, Facebook friends to interpret the world as they know it. Further eroding trust on the subject of today's webinar are the attention-getting interpreters, including media who are intentionally perpetrating false information and interpretations, at least some of them. Conspiracy theories are by definition theories, neither fact or fiction. When fictitious, they're dangerous, and they're contributing to personal and social distrust. We've asked Michel Gagne to help us untangle fact from fiction. Welcome, Michel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Your interests and credentials as a conspiracy researcher are impressive. As we noted in the newsletter, you're a historian who teaches critical thinking, conspiracism, philosophy of religion, political philosophy, and ethics. Interesting topic because we'll be discussing AI and ethics next week. But you're in the Humanities Department of Champaign College, St. Lambert, Junior College in Montreal, Quebec. You're also the author of Thinking Critically About the Kennedy Assassination, Debunking the Myths and Conspiracy Theories. It was published by Routledge in 2022, and you're a contributor to several academic and journalistic publications, and the creator, writer, and host of Paranoid Planet podcast, an educational variety show about conspiracy beliefs and related topics. And you're also a senior fellow of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. So we're delighted that you've agreed to participate with us and enter into a discussion about conspiracy theories, their source, and their implications. So I'm going to let you take it from there. So Michel, introduce yourself and let the show begin.
Well, thank you, Perry. It's an honor to be here. It kind of came out of the blue, and I'm quite happy to be part of this. Yeah, so over here in Quebec, they call me Michel, although I remember living in Saskatchewan, and that was a bit aversive to some people. They couldn't understand why a guy would be called Michel. So my name is Michel J Gagne. I do teach in a junior college. I teach humanities. The nice thing about that is I get to teach more or less at the level of a university courses, except there's no compulsion to publish or research. I think some of my colleagues maybe find that just enough for them. I felt compelled to be more of a public intellectual, but it was nice that I didn't have to write for these narrow journals that only 10 people will read me. I can publish things that are maybe for a wider audience. Yes, I am a senior fellow at the Aristotle Foundation. Some of you may be familiar with Mark Milke and his work. So I joined largely because he invited me to write various pieces on conspiracy theories. I have this book on the Kennedy assassination. I consider myself a recovering conspiracist. I spent many years on the other side of the fence, speculating about a number of different things that may have been true about the CIA and things like that. And then I think I had a kind of an aha experience where I realized that I was seeking far more complicated answers that fed my emotions rather than fit the facts. So I decided that I needed that for myself, and eventually I needed to use that to teach my students, a bit as a mea culpa, because when I was a high school teacher, I would often be advocating for certain conspiracy theories that I thought were true back then. So I also do the podcast, which also is meant to be more for a general audience, for students kind of the age that I teach, 17, 18-year-olds, but also anybody who has a sense of humor and wants to talk about this controversial issue. So why did I write this article? Well, firstly, the Aristotle Foundation asked me to, and I felt that it was an appropriate subject. The Trump assassination attempt made me riveted. I was reading articles all weekend long, trying to understand who this young man might be and whether he might have any similarities to some of the other young men. Often they're young, usually they're men. Often they're white, but not always, who have engaged in violence, generally what we might call lone wolf violence. Occasionally there are small conspiracies of 2 or 3, but we do see a pattern, and that is disenchanted young men, perhaps economically, emotionally, or in some from society. They feel the need to lash out. and they pick victims that sometimes don't make sense to the rest of us. Often these days, they are other school children, but they might just be, immigrants who are crossing the street, or in this particular case, a very high-profile politician. So I think that Thomas Crooks seems to fall in the category of people like Lee Harvey Oswald, Sirhan, and many others who have targeted presidents and major figures. Um, so that's one of the reasons why I wrote it. Now, I had many things that I wanted to say. I ended up writing an essay that was almost 1,500 words long, and the foundation wanted something that was more of an editorial size so they could pitch it to newspapers. So the Epoch Times ended up running what I think is a decent article, but I think it's actually been edited and reduced a great deal. There were a lot of things that I wanted to say. So firstly, what I wanted to say was when you look at the profile of this particular shooter, it fits in with a whole bunch of other people who act out largely for emotional, psychological problems. They're not necessarily mentally ill, but they are emotionally stunted. And quite often they lash out with a particular political ideology in mind. And so it's not unusual that young men like Thomas Crooks, now I don't know yet, but definitely other people like him have used conspiracy theories and that kind of information in order to give themselves some sort of legitimacy. They are willing to die, usually in a blaze of glory, because it's a form of suicide attempt that perhaps speaks to their strength rather than their weaknesses, and it is done in a way that people will talk about them. One thing I learned about Lee Harvey Oswald is we've been arguing for 60 years about his motive. He certainly had one, though he may have had two or three versions. He's not a guy who was easy to read, but the main one is he wanted to prove he wasn't a nobody, and that might actually been the priority. The act is more about a person affirming themselves than trying to prove anything in particular.
Let me interrupt you there just for a
Yes,
second.
go ahead. I'm going to put on my earphones so I hear you better.
This point was made to me this morning as we were getting ready for this session. They were talking about the Lee Harvey Oswald and said if he was seeking notoriety, why didn't he admit to the shooting? Apparently, during the period when he was incarcerated before he was shot himself, they say he never did admit or confess to being the assassin. In which case, that seems to be contrary to, quote, evidence that he was seeking notoriety. Any
Uh,
comment?
there's a number of answers to that. Again, we can speculate because the man didn't say much.
Right.
His brother Robert certainly believed that that whole weekend Lee Oswald was toying with the cops. He believed he was the smartest man in the room, and he remained cool all the time, except twice when they kept trying to link him to the rifle. Oswald was determined not to let the evidence of the rifle get connected to him, and perhaps if a court because there was going to be a court case if he didn't plead guilty, he was going to go as far as he could, trying to show that the police were incompetent. So
Okay.
one of them was to assert his intelligence that way, and he was a fairly smart guy. He was crafty. The other one was there was an FBI agent called James Hosty who was responsible for finding Oswald in the weeks before the assassination because he had been in Mexico City speaking to people in the Soviet embassy. They never found him in time, but Agent Hosty did actually visit Oswald's wife's house because they were not living together at the time and interviewed her twice. And that's where Lee got very angry. So he kept his cool. And I believe he was waiting to do all of this in court. He had already asked to see a high profile lawyer from New York called John Abt, who was known for defending left wing activists. So I
Okay.
think there's a reason why he was biding his time. Yeah.
So for more, I didn't expect we'd get into a discourse on the book itself, but the book's worth reading. Clearly, you did your research on who he was and some of the theories that are associated with that shooting. So I'll let you proceed then. So jump
Okay,
back.
no problem, no problem. Some of the other things I want to be able to move into here, and I think this is where me and the editors kind of diverged, is they didn't want this piece to be too political. They wanted to speak largely to epistemic matters. How do we know that something is true or false? And how do we not jump the gun when we watch the news, imagining other scenarios? But to me, one of the big issues, and I think it's a big point in my book and in the conclusion to the book, and that's the whole issue of public discourse and public opinion. Conspiracy theories are, as I think I don't have the article right here in front of me, but I said they're a kind of they're what do you call it? They're a kind of a mill for myth making. And so they allow people and groups to try to make sense of a complex reality in a fairly simplistic way. And sometimes the media participates in that. Just yesterday, in fact, there was a shooting in Georgia. And one of the people in the media, I forget if it was the police officer or if it was the principal, talked a lot about love and hate. We want love, we don't want haters. But at the end of the day, that doesn't really mean anything. Everybody hates something and loves something else. So perhaps the problem is something greater than just hate and love. It may have to do with, I believe, feelings of alienation, issues of gun control. It may also be culture. We've been talking about toxic masculinity. There's a lot of issues that are sometimes identified as being identifiable to race. There is a debate that needs to be made, but when everybody's talking at the same time, the most qualified people tend to get muted. So I think public discourse is not well served by a lot of the internet social networks. What I like is the way that certain news services will encourage intelligent debate and also invite debaters. Like Newsweek does this a lot. They will have kind of a featured debate every day, an article for and against something that Trump said, for example. I think that's good public debate.
One of the things I look for, and I think all of us are now aware that there's this issue of misinformation, but one doesn't formulate a theory on just a single observation or a single point. And yet it seems to me a lot of the things that are floating around are really stretching a single point or even correlation, assuming cause, and a quote conspiracy. The word conspiracy to me, and I'd like you to define what is a conspiracy theory anyway. But a conspiracy implies that somehow there's this undercurrent with the motive broader than simply interpreting a single fact.
Yeah, it's good to define our terms. And the problem with conspiracy theory is it tends to be used in a number of different ways. One way that I reject is using it as a blanket term for crackpot people who believe nonsense.
Right.
Because we know that some conspiracies turn out to be true, and that means that Bob Woodward and Bernstein was his first name of the Washington Post were conspiracy theorists as they were working their way to understanding who was involved in the Watergate break-in. But there is such a thing, and I usually use the definition used by a British philosopher called Kasim Kassam, and that is, he says, conspiracy theories with a capital C and a capital T. Because technically, a birthday party, no, that's planned in secret is a conspiracy. But we don't really mean that. We mean something nefarious, perhaps illegal, a small, not necessarily small, a group of people, two or more people, planning together in secret for some nefarious purpose, right? Manipulation, winning elections, making money, that sort of thing. Now, where Kasim Kassam says there are kind of realistic conspiracy theories and these more far-fetched ones with a capital C, capital T, is the fact that a lot of what passes as conspiracy theories, the ones that are very popular, JFK, 9/11, UFOs, first of all, they tend to be promoted by people who are amateurs. They're not necessarily experts in their field. The second one is they tend to evoke a lot of esoteric claims about, technology that we don't know if it exists, or mind control, or, new age forces, things like that. There are other points as well that he made, and they're in an article that I wrote. But essentially, conspiracy theories tend to be more of a form of propaganda than they are a form of responsible research.
Well, that was
Go ahead.
that's an important point to make. I think the term, when something is termed a conspiracy theory, it's meant to be a smear. It's meant to smear the legitimacy of that observation. And yet, as you've noted, sometimes, quote, a conspiracy theory may be true, in which case smearing it has public consequences.
So I don't avoid using the term. I try to qualify it in advance. If,
Yeah.
for example, for my podcast, I'm reaching out to someone who believes in a conspiracy explanation, I'll try to call them a conspiracy researcher or just a researcher because that's what they like to be called. But these terms are often used. Even conspiracy theorists will use the term official story, which there's nothing wrong with that. It just means the reigning consensus. At least that's what it should mean. But they take it to mean the lies that the government wants you to believe. So these are all weasel words, right? Conspiracy theory, official story. And so we have to sometimes unpack and explain before we can really get to the meat and potatoes. So yes, you're correct about that.
Well, the other points being made is that when power speaks and people get very suspicious about power, power corrupts absolute, power corrupts absolutely, they get very suspicious of information coming out of a power source, assuming that that information is being manipulated in the interest of the speaker or the interest of the source, whether it be the government, a radio station, a TV station, or media in general. And then criticize capitalism, say, well, capitalism owns all the communication sources and they don't have any interest in truth. So it tends to undermine, that was my opener, is, who to trust. So often the byproduct of all of this is eroding general trust in our institutions.
Yeah, and when the conspiracy claim becomes so abstract that we can't even identify individuals, but rather this entire, plethora of invisible actors working as a group, then we're getting really into the world of imagination. The international Jewish a conspiracy, or the Freemasons, or even just the CIA. How often do people use the term the government? To say about UFO cover-ups. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people here. You're going to have to be more specific than the government.
Or the cabal presumably behind the World Economic Forum.
Yes, yes. So as soon as people they start to overgeneralize, I identify that as a red flag. There's a number of things like that's what I teach. I teach students to identify poor arguments, poor reasoning, so that they're not taken in. And sometimes it's interesting. A student will come back to me and say, I was having a conversation with my dad about this yesterday, and I was asking him for his sources and evidence. And I was asking, and then he says, and we just got an argument. I said, yes, maybe it wasn't the best time to do that at the dinner table. But certainly if you're going to engage somebody in a public debate, then you want to make sure that you ask them, what do you mean by this? What is your source? How much can you prove from what you just gave me?
But it's this undermining of our institutions. The COVID certainly had a significant impact on the trust we have in the health organizations, in the politicians having jumped in whether doctors are leaning one way or another, whether it be on unmasking or the efficacy of vaccinations. I mean, and we're seeing even in the school system, this post-COVID impact has led to a lot of theories as to who's to blame for the deterioration in the grades of the students. So, and whether that's by design, as someone says, where we're trying to downgrade our intellectuals. We're trying to take reason out of society where emotions will be the generalizers. We live in chaos.
We do, but conspiracies are only one kind of stories that actually bring us a certain amount of comfort. It's strange to say that you get comfort from a very frightening story about cabals controlling your life. But if you can identify who the bad guys are and you're not one of them, it does bring a certain amount of comfort. So conspiracy theories are reactions to discomfort, to times of maybe existential angst, economic uncertainty, and they allow us to point the finger away from ourselves. And they're simplistic, and they could be delusive, or the fruit of delusion. But ultimately, they bring us a kind of an idea that the world makes sense again. Even if it's evil, even if it's broken, it seems to make sense because now it's not chaos. There are bad guys who are responsible for what's happening to me. Right? I walked out of my apartment back in the early 2000s while I was a high school teacher, and I was a big fan of the Kennedy assassinations, and I engaged in a lot of conspiracy kind of speculation, and my car was gone. And then I thought the CIA did this, right? That was my first thought. Now, within a minute, I thought, no, that's crazy. But I was wondering, why did I have that reaction? It's because I was reading all these conspiracy books written by people who say the CIA is out to get them because they know the truth about Kennedy. And it turns out my car was really 3 blocks away. There'd been a snowstorm, and I hadn't seen the signs that said no parking and took it away, right? That Occam's razor, right? Turns out there was a simple explanation, but it wasn't the one that I felt was right. And so I jumped to the assumption of what felt right, given what was going on in my mind. What was my preoccupation?
Emotion, the relationship, and we've talked about this many, many times in earlier webinars, of the interrelationship between reason and emotion, and how this battle, and the brain with one hemisphere and another hemisphere is in this constant battle between rationalizing, and that's almost the Middle Age, since the Middle Age concept, the role of reason. We've elevated to an extraordinary level in our society, a knowledge-based economy, knowledge-based society. But all of a sudden we have AI, we have conspiracy theories. There's a lot of things going on that are undermining our confidence in reason, our capacity of our brains to sort through all of what's going on, to come with some, well, Occam's razor, reasonable, simple explanation.
Yeah. But the rational experiments of, the Enlightenment, or I would say even ancient Greece, were meant to encourage doubt and skepticism, but we don't tolerate that much anymore. The conspiracy mindset is hyper-rationalistic. That's another one of those points by Kasim Kassam that I'd forgotten earlier, that they're very deterministic, as if everything has to work out a certain way because the elites made it this way, right? There's no room for chaos. There's no room for whistleblowers who suddenly have they had a change of mind and then they speak out. They've all been silenced. That's the assumption. So yeah, this hyper rationalization leads to seeing patterns where there are no patterns.
And a reluctance to compromise. I mean, I don't
Yes.
find that people that are perpetrating a false conspiracy, I think they talk a lot. I think they've got a lot of logic, like snake oil salesmen. They've got a lot of logic, but the speed at which they speak leaves you confused. And in my discussions with them, I've asked them to stop speaking over me and let me express myself, to listen and probe, as you said, ask questions. They don't like being asked questions.
Yeah, I like you bring up the word compromise, because that's just actually something that the aftermath of the assassination attempt on Trump showed us the tendency on both sides of the political fence to reach these apocalyptic conclusions. On one side, people were saying that Donald Trump will bring the end of democracy, that he wants to put women in prison for getting an abortion, and a lot of these things. And on the other side, of course, we have a lot of the MAGA group who are believing that it's the end of the world if stay in power 1 minute more. So definitely the need to compromise is something that seems to have been forgotten. I remember the 1990s, before the Newt Gingrich revolution, where people were complaining that in the States, Democrats and Republicans were too similar. Right? They called them the Republicrats. There's no such thing anymore. I think Newt Gingrich is one of those people who kind of brought this cleavage, and now never the twain shall meet. And that's unfortunate, because our neighbor to the south, like Canadian and British institutions, are designed for compromise. They're designed to bring people of two different solitudes, and at least make them reluctantly agree on what's basically necessary. I lean slightly right in my political views, but I understand gun control and abortion are two things that are never going to work out in the way that liberals and conservatives want. We're going to have to, at some point, agree to disagree and forge something that nobody likes. But perhaps it's necessary. Is it going to happen anytime soon? Probably not. But that's how the institutions are meant to work, when they're actually working well, when the people who are elected actually come in good faith, willing to explore various possibilities, and say they're willing to compromise on something, even though it might not be their first choice. So conspiracy thinking, ultimately, it attacks democracy. It attacks our ability to tolerate uncertainty and to see the humanity in each other.
One of the excuses that people have given to those that are perpetrating the conspiracy theories is that they're just embellishing. They're just being entertaining, without addressing the fact that they are really undermining trust. Entertainment is one thing. A comedy we can understand. We can understand humor. We can understand laughing. But when someone is perpetrating fear and hate, it's gone beyond comedy. And
Hmm.
it seems to me that the sociological consequences of this continued um, perpetration of falsehoods and assuming there is some underlying motive of some cabal uh, formulates in young people enormous distrust in the institutional structures that we've come to rely on.
Yeah, conspiracy is a great, it attracts a lot of people to the cinema. I mean, I love watching a good conspiracy thriller. Generally, I understand that this is not reality. And then when I leave or when I turn off the Netflix, I understand that the world I live in is different than the one on screen. Occasionally, a conspiracy thriller kind of oversteps its bounds, and many people start thinking that although it's fiction, it's really real. Uh, Former Governor Jesse Ventura, former wrestler, former governor, former many things, is want for doing that frequently. He says if you want to understand the Kennedy assassination, you have to watch Executive Action, JFK, 3 Days of the Condor. And I'm thinking, well, hold on a second. You're asking us to go into the across the mirror, to use a Alice in Wonderland analogy, and then you want us to think that that's the real world. And I have on my shelf here. I'm trying to see if I can spot it. I have the Da Vinci Code,
Yeah.
which personally was not a very good piece of writing. I like to write. I do write some fiction, though none of it is published. I can't say that I'm a great writer, but I thought I was good enough to see that this was not a very well written book. It was kind of sophomoric. But the reason it sold so well is it had this one page at the beginning of the novel that said fact. And then it listed a number of things that really were red herrings. It had nothing to do with the story, but it made it look like everything else in this book is actually fact or based on fact. And that book did a great disservice to people who are not practicing Christians. Most Christians that I knew thought it was risible. But it was interesting. I went to the Côte St. Luc Library once with a friend where it has a very, very large Jewish population here in Montreal. And it was amazing how many Jewish old ladies were there listening to this conference by a historian who was trying to debunk the conspiracy theories about the Da Vinci Code. And hear these ladies like, no, 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 it can't be because I read this and I read that. They were really taken in by the story because they couldn't tell what was true and what was not. I did the same thing in my local public library about the Kennedy assassination. And many of the people who came were baby boomers between probably 60 and 80 years old, many people who spent many years reading about the Kennedy assassination. And I could tell that they respected my point of view, but many of them left thinking it can't just be one man with one gun. They wanted to believe that there was something more to it. The military industrial complex, the Vietnam War, Watergate, to them, all of that was proof that Kennedy had to die for a reason, which was he wanted to bring peace. Right.
So as we get to a wrap-up point, I'm going to pose probably the most difficult question and the one you probably think most about is what can we do to help young people? I'm going to focus on kids. How can we help young people? You are an educator. You mentioned to me at one point you chose which conspiracy theories you thought were facts. And when you were in school, do I dare use the word indoctrinated, but you interpreted the world as kids need some help. But did you give them processes? What processes can we give young kids? What processes can adults use in order to sort through this chaos?
Yeah. Well, I did the bad thing when I was a high school teacher, which is I invited some of the boys in my history class to come watch Oliver Stone's JFK movie at lunchtime. And that created a whole bunch of conversations and debates. And, I never really believed in a lot of the main conspiracy theories, but I would say that Kennedy, 9/11, these are things where I had a lot of niggling doubts. And there I was not indoctrinating, but I was influencing. And it's interesting now that I teach college, some of my students will say, oh, I had a great history teacher in high school who showed us that the CIA killed Kennedy. And then they're kind of shaking my head going, all right, well, wait a few months and we'll see where you stand then. Um, I don't know if there's a single answer, but I'm 50 years old now, so maybe I'm not the right person to be doing this anymore. But I think we do need people who are knowledgeable and who also understand the way young people seek information. I'm too old and not technologically savvy enough to do kind of a TikTok video series about, false conspiracy claims. But I do have a podcast and I do try to make it fun. And I see it kind of as, candy for the brain. I kind of slip in some humor in there. I try to bring in some levity, and then boom, we'll have an hour and a half conversation with a professor of history or a major journalist and try to unpack some conspiracy theory and identify what's wrong with it. So I think you need kind of this two-way approach. And it's not just kids. I think all people who are not necessarily specialists are going to get bored quickly if there's not a lot of bells and whistles. And unfortunately, like the History Channel or whatever passes for something like that, documentaries these days are way too much, they're skewed towards suspicion and not enough towards how does stuff really work? It should be like a popular mechanics approach to conspiracy theories. Make it illustrated, make it fun, bring in celebrities, but make sure that you speak to the science and to the history first and foremost.
So those recommendations are well taken in order to get people's attention and to hold kids' attention through humor, etc. But we hear the phrases critical thinking. But what does critical thinking mean from your perspective?
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people hear the word critical and they think critical theory, critical race theory, or just criticizing people. And it's none of those things. If anything, I tell my students very early in the term that critical thinking is first and foremost criticizing oneself, not debasing oneself, but being aware of one's own biases. And that often means having some kind of activity where they have to reflect on what was it in their life and their past in relationships with their friends that make them believe in a particular idea, right? And I don't just do that in critical thinking or conspiracy theories. I do this in my ethics class as well. Having students, take a position, for example, on whether or not they should murder Hitler, whether or not they believe Terry Schiavo's feeding tube should have been removed, things like that. And then to say, well, what is it in your life? Did you have an uncle who was really ill? Did this make you want to believe in medical aid in dying, that it was legitimate? And then sometimes I'll share a personal story. My stepfather died last year, 2 years ago, of cancer. He probably would have died of natural causes within 48 hours, but he had asked for medical aid in dying, and the rest of the family were in favor of it. So I kind of pulled back and I said, well, if that's what you guys want, I just feel that we're playing God here. I feel that we could just let nature take its course. So that doesn't have to do with critical thinking. But I think personal stories, I was raised in a church, so testimonies usually are always more powerful than abstract theology. And I think it's the same thing. If you smother a person too much with technicalities, like here are 82 reasons why UFOs are false, you're going to lose them at number 5. But if you can have an interesting conversation or even a piece of fiction that makes them more doubtful
Mhm.
of the suspicious narrative, that might be useful. A lot of Hollywood films actually are very good at saying that the main character thought there was a massive conspiracy, but it ended up being a massive delusion. In fact, I start my book on Kennedy discussing Christopher Nolan's great film Memento, which is a man who believes there are people who killed his wife and he's out to kill them. And in the end, we find out, spoiler alert, it's a massive self-delusion. The person is tilting at windmills, but every time he kills someone new, he feels satisfaction. Unfortunately, he has no long-term memory. So every day he wakes up and he starts the whole process over again. And conspiracy theories often do that. They keep us feeling like we're the heroes in our life story, but at the cost of our own ignorance and self-delusion. So I think that maybe sometimes it's about highlighting the right stuff from Hollywood or from novels, and then identifying the erroneous ones. So Da Vinci Code, JFK. I don't ignore them. I will show them or discuss them in class. Students might be familiar with them, maybe not so much Da Vinci Code anymore, but anything that's more recent, and then showing them when it's done well. That might be useful as well.
While it may not be to confront conspiracy theories, Kennedy introduced a process to cabinet after the Cuban Missile Crisis to confront groupthink. And that was every time a position was taken, he asked that party to present the opposite. So to look at both pros and cons from both sides of the story, I think that's another approach. As you say, a healthy degree of skepticism can in itself lead to conspiracy theory, but at the same time, it does force you to take a well-rounded perspective at this information as a quote theory, where
Yes.
only facts are going to break it down. And that means probing, and that means asking for evidence.
Yeah. President Kennedy had many flaws, but one of his strengths was he was willing to let people outside the box have a say. You know, he brought in Lyndon Johnson. Everyone in his entourage hated Johnson, but Kennedy saw a value for having Johnson there. And he also had Douglas Dillon, I believe, who was a Republican. And when he replaced Allen Dulles of the CIA, he replaced him with, yes, a Boston Catholic, but a Republican, who was John McCone. So Kennedy was willing to have that diversity of opinion. Before this webinar started recording, I mentioned Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford is another leader who liked to have contrary opinions in the room. That's why actually he got Donald Rumsfeld to be his chief of staff. He didn't particularly like Rumsfeld, but he thought that Rumsfeld would bring a different perspective than his. And I think Ford, again, was flawed in some ways, but generally a good man who was willing to entertain a multiplicity of opinions, to open the books, to have transparency. And that's why I often celebrate Ford as the counter Trump. Whereas Donald Trump traffics in conspiracy theories, Ford dedicated much of his life in office to debunking them, either as a member of the Warren Commission. He eventually wrote a biography of Lee Oswald. He also, yes, he did forgive Nixon, but he also tried to give amnesty to draft dodgers. And then he used this occasion to open the books on the federal government, primarily through the Rockefeller Commission, but also the Church Committee and the HSCA. Then, the houses of Congress then opened their own investigation as well under his watch. So I think Ford is a great leader to look up to as someone who will permit dissent and more transparency.
Well, this approach also is one on how you go about confronting ideological conspiracies. When someone is taking an ideological position, such as, let's say, Trump, uh, others are prepared to bring Republicans into a Democratic cabinet or Democrats into a Republican cabinet as a way of ensuring that ideology is not the sole driver of what should be based on empiricism or what is in fact best for the public rather than what is consistent with their ideology. So I think we've addressed, or you've addressed well, an approach that Ford seems to be recognized, which is compromise. And that's not when one is ideologically committed to a position, compromise is unacceptable.
Yeah. Unfortunately for Ford, he's not remembered for compromise. He's remembered for pardoning Nixon. And it turns out he actually thought that Nixon was about to die. I don't know if many people know this. Nixon was suffering of a blood clot in his leg, and his daughter had kind of told Gerald Ford that he was not doing well. And Gerald Ford believed that by pardoning Nixon, it meant that Nixon is actually conceding that he's guilty. So it's bringing a guilty plea and then turning the page and moving on. Unfortunately, the rascal lived on another 15, 20 years, right? So for Ford, maybe it was a gamble that worked against him politically, but I think it shows that the man had a certain gravitas, at least ethically, that many leaders don't have.
Well, we're at wrap up, Michael.
Yeah.
I want to thank you very much. I think we've touched on a number of issues that I had listed here. We understand that conspiracy theories are often generated for political gain. We've touched on the role of politicians and political parties in order to gain positions. Will twist truth and make accusations of others and what their motives are in order to differentiate and manipulate public opinion. A second, we haven't talked about this at great length, which is for financial profit, like a book. But some individuals and organizations spread false theories to generate revenue. Then we get media attention, eyeballs, controversy sells. We see that with the media all the time, the contrast between Fox News and CNN or NBC. We see it all the time where different opinions and almost ideologies are presented in order to get more eyeballs and sell more. Ideological agendas we've touched on, the psychological and emotional control perpetrated for children in particular through theories, whether or not it's the witch in the forest, a form of a conspiracy theory in order to manipulate and say, keep children out of the forest, or make them be conscious of what is safe space and what's not. And then I guess the big one, these disinformation campaigns, of whether Iran and Russia and China and others are engaged in campaigns to feed information in volume through new technologies in order to dissuade society and direct it and manipulate it in terms of who to trust and who not to. So we've touched on many of these points today, and to that extent, I want to thank you and ask you if you have a last word that you'd like to share with us.
I don't know. I don't think so. I think I've covered most of the bases. I mean, I took a few notes and I didn't want to be too prepared. So I think, yeah, I feel free to buy my book, listen to my podcast, anything like that, and send me an email if you have a question, a comment, or dare I say, a critique, and I'll be happy to answer you.